Nobody in the court had ever heard anyone say his name. Not the ambassadors who came bearing treaties soaked in blood and wax. Not the ancient vampires who had served him for centuries, their loyalty as old as the stone beneath the castle. Not the humans who had wandered foolishly or bravely into his presence. Not even his own blood-sworn council, who addressed him only as Your Majesty or my king, their voices dipping into reverence so deep it bordered on fear. His name was known, technically. It existed in documents older than most cities, scrawled into vellum that had yellowed and cracked, while empires rose and fell around it. It was whispered in history books that circulated in the vampire realm, spoken only when he was not present, and even then, quietly, as though the syllables themselves carried some consequence. Zara Reeves had read those books. She had read everything she could get her hands on in the weeks since her life had been upended, and she had found herself, against every reasonable argument she had made to herself, working as a human liaison in the court of the Vampire King. She had not meant to end up here. Most people who ended up in the court had not meant to end up here. It had started with a contract. Her best friend, Lily, had been a human liaison before her, one of the few humans permitted inside the court beneath the city, the vast underground palace that sprawled beneath London like a second civilization, ancient and cold and magnificent. When Lily had needed to leave for personal reasons she would not explain in full, she had asked Zara to take her place temporarily. 3 months, she had said. Just 3 months. You are the only person I trust. You know the history, you know the rules. You are careful and clever, and they will not eat you. That last part had been meant as comfort. Zara had not found it particularly comforting. But she had come anyway, because Lily had looked at her with those tired, complicated eyes, and because Zara had never been good at saying no to the people she loved, and because some part of her, the part that had spent years buried in books as about the vampire realm and its politics and its history, was curious in the way that certain dangerous things make you curious, the way the edge of a cliff makes you want to look down. That had been 6 weeks ago. In those 6 weeks she had learned a great many things. She had learned that the court was run by a council of 7 vampires, each ancient in their own right, each representing a bloodline of staggering power. She had learned that the humans who served here were protected by something called the Liaison Accord, a centuries-old agreement that made harming a sworn human liaison punishable by exile or death. She had learned that the food served at court functions was not what it appeared to be, and she should always ask before eating anything. She had learned that the vampires had a formal hierarchy so intricate and specific that a wrong bow could cause a diplomatic incident, and she had studied it the way she had once studied for exams, obsessively and late into the night. And she had learned above all other things that the Vampire King was not to be trifled with. His council called him Your Majesty. His subjects called him My King. The ancient texts called him Valdris the Eternal, Valdris the Unmerciful in the early years, Valdris the Arbiter in the centuries after he had rewritten the blood laws, and ended 3 wars with what scholars agreed was terrifying efficiency. Valdris. She had thought the name so many times in her own head that it had lost some of its weight for her, the way any word will if you repeat it often enough. She had sat in council meetings and watched him at the head of the long obsidian table, and thought Valdris when the council said, My King, and Valdris when he spoke in that low, measured voice that seemed to fill the room without effort, and Valdris when his pale gaze moved across the room and landed briefly on her, the way the beam of a lighthouse lands on water, illuminating nothing, simply moving. He was not what she had expected. She had expected cold. She had gotten cold, yes, but it was a complex cold, a cold with layers. He was white-haired in the way old marble is white, not faded but inherent, as though he had been made that way from the beginning. His skin was the pale of moonstone, luminous in the underground light of the court, which ran on specially designed systems that mimicked the spectrum of light that would not hurt them. He was tall in the way architecture is tall, and his face was the kind of beautiful that felt almost aggressive, sharp and symmetrical and proud. He wore his royalty not like clothing but like bone structure, something intrinsic and unperformable. In 6 weeks he had spoken to her directly exactly 4 times. The first time he had asked her to restate a point she had made in a council presentation. His voice had been even, and his gaze had been unreadable. She had restated the point clearly, and he had nodded once and looked away. The second time, he had told her that her proposed revision to the inter-realm communication protocol was adequate. Adequate had felt like the highest compliment she had received in her professional life, which probably said something about the effect this place was having on her perspective. The third time, he had told her to step back during a moment of tension between two council members, his arm moving in front of her, before she had even processed the danger, a reflexive barrier she had not asked for and had not expected, and had thought about more than she would like to admit. The fourth time had been just yesterday, when he had passed her in the corridor outside the council chamber and said, with no particular affect, that she had forgotten her identification badge, and she should not walk the lower corridors without it. She had been holding the badge in her hand at the time. She had said, "Thank you, Your Majesty," and he had kept walking without response. And she had stood there, feeling vaguely like she had just failed a test she had not known she was taking. Today was the solstice convening. The solstice convening happened twice a year, on the winter and summer solstices, and it was the most formally significant event on the court calendar. Every bloodline with a seat at the table sent representatives. The human governments who maintained diplomatic relationships with the court sent their own representatives, quiet and carefully chosen. People who had signed enough non-disclosure agreements to wallpaper a house. The hall where the convening was held was the largest space Zara had seen underground, with ceilings that arched like a cathedral and walls that were lined with tapestries depicting 400 years of vampire history. And at the far end, a throne made of something that looked like black glass and probably was not. Zara was there as the human liaison representative, which meant she stood slightly to the left of the main gathering, close enough to observe and participate when called upon, far enough to signal that she was present by invitation rather than by right. She wore the formal clothes the court had provided, dark and precisely cut, and her badge, which she had checked 3 times before leaving her quarters. She had a folder of documents under her arm. She had a pen. She had memorized the order of address and the formal greetings in the old tongue, which she had been practicing with one of the lesser court attendants, a young vampire named Everis, who had found her attempts both impressive and deeply amusing. She was prepared. What she was not prepared for was Lord Casimir Vrath. Casimir Vrath was the oldest member of the council, which meant something significant when you considered that all council members were at minimum 400 years old. He was the representative of the Vrath bloodline, one of the original founding bloodlines of the court, and he had made no secret, in Zara's 6 weeks of observation, of his contempt for the human liaison program in general, and for her in particular. He had twice questioned her presence in council meetings. He had once, speaking in the old tongue as though she could not understand it, referred to her as the human trinket. She had understood every word and had not shown it on her face. Today, as the convening began and the vast hall filled with the gathered representatives, Casimir positioned himself near the human diplomatic section, with a deliberateness that made Zara's spine straighten on instinct. He was tall and spare, his white hair pulled severely back, his dark eyes moving over her with the particular expression of someone who has decided they already know what they are looking at. "The liaison program," he said, addressing her directly for the first time in 6 weeks, his voice carrying in the acoustics of the hall in a way she did not think was accidental, was established as a concession to human political sensibilities, a politeness, not a mandate. Zara looked at him. "Good evening, Lord Casimir. At the solstice convening, a sacred function of this court is an imposition, one I intend to raise formally today." The hall was not entirely quiet yet. People were still moving, finding positions, speaking in low voices. But the people nearest to them had stopped their own conversations. She could feel it, the attention shifting, delicate and hungry. "You have every right to raise it formally," Zara said. She kept her voice level, the way she had taught herself to speak in this place, clear but not challenging, grounded but not submissive. "And the council has the right to address it. That's how the process works." Casimir's eyes narrowed fractionally. "You quote the process to me." "I quote the process that protects both of us," she said. Lord Casimir. The title was correct. The tone was correct. But something in the exchange had sharpened, and the people nearby were fully stopped now, turned, watching. Among them were two other council members, Sorvain of the Durav bloodline and Ilara of the ancient Thessaly line, and their expressions were carefully neutral in the way that meant they were paying close attention. Casimir took one step closer to her. "Do you understand what this court is?" "I do," she said. "Do you understand what you are within it?" "Yes," she said. "I am the human liaison, sworn under the accord, present by the king's sanction, as I have been for 6 weeks." She paused. "And I would appreciate you not standing quite so close to me, Lord Casimir. You are currently in violation of the proximity clause of the liaison accord, which specifies that no court member may position themselves within arm's reach of a liaison without expressed invitation. I believe you know that." The silence around them was now very loud. Casimir's expression shifted, something moving behind his eyes that she could not entirely read, old and cold and calculating. He did not step back. Instead, he said, very quietly, "You are very confident for a creature that lives for barely a century, and something in Zara, 6 weeks of careful navigation, of memorized protocols and deliberate restraint, simply reached its end." "I am confident," she said, "because I have done my work and I know my rights, and I am standing exactly where I am supposed to be." She squared her shoulders. "And if you have a problem with that, take it up with Valdris." The silence that followed was of a different quality entirely. It was not the silence of people paying attention. It was the silence of people who had stopped breathing, not metaphorically. Vampires did not need to breathe as humans did, but they did breathe habitually, the rhythm of it, a kind of biological memory that persisted through the centuries. Every vampire in the immediate vicinity had, in the same instant, stopped that habitual motion. A council member near the far wall had turned. Everis, standing by a pillar, had gone so still he looked like part of the architecture. Casimir's face had done something extraordinary. He had gone, if possible, more pale. Zura realized, in the 3 seconds after she spoke, what she had done. She had said his name. She had said Valdris. "Not your majesty. Not the king. Not my liege or his grace or any of the dozen titles that surrounded him like armor." She had used his first name, the name from the old documents, the name nobody said, as a casual conclusion to an argument with a council lord, and she had said it in the middle of the solstice convening, in a hall full of the most powerful vampires on the continent. She was still holding her folder of documents. Her pen was still in her hand. She was very aware of both. She did not look away from Casimir. She would not give herself the exit of looking elsewhere. She held his gaze and waited. From the far end of the hall, from the direction of the throne that was made of something like black glass, there was the sound of footsteps. They were unhurried. They were even. They were the footsteps of someone who had never in his very long existence needed to rush toward anything because things waited for him. The crowd parted. Of course it parted. It parted the way water parts around something absolute, not out of choice, but out of physical necessity. Valdris moved through it, and the hall rearranged itself around him, the gathered representatives shifting without apparent intention, opening a path that led directly to where Zara was standing with her folder and her pen, and the weight of what she had said still hanging in the air. He stopped. He was close, closer than the formal distance, closer than the council members generally stood to anyone, and his pale eyes were on her with an expression she could not name. Not anger, not amusement. Something still, and measuring, and very, very present. The entire hall was not breathing. "Your Majesty," Casimir said, his voice strained thin. "The liaison." "I am aware," Valdris said. He had not looked at Casimir. He was looking at Zara. "Lord Casimir, you will step back." There was no please. There was no particular force in it, no volume. It was simply what was going to happen, and Casimir stepped back, and the clause about proximity was satisfied without further discussion. Valdris looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were a pale grey that shaded toward silver in certain lights, and in the lighting of the convening hall they were very nearly luminous. "You are not frightened," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am a little frightened," she said honestly. Something moved across his face, fine as the shift of light on water, and was gone. "Good," he said. "You should be." He turned to address the hall, and his voice carried to every corner without effort. The liaison continues in her sanctioned role. Anyone who raises a formal challenge to that role will do so through the proper council process, and not through proximity intimidation in the middle of my convening. His gaze swept the gathered company with the particular quality of a blade being shown rather than used. Are we clear? It was not a question either. The hall responded with the murmured agreement of 100 powerful beings who all understood the hierarchy they were part of, and Valdres turned back toward the throne and walked, and the hall reformed around him like water healing over a stone. Zara let out a breath. Everest materialized at her elbow approximately 30 seconds later, moving with the silent speed of someone who was very excited but managing it. You said his name, Everest whispered. I noticed, Zara said, in the middle of the convening. I noticed that too. Nobody has evers. Everest stopped, recalibrated. You are either the bravest human I have ever met or the most accidentally dangerous. Zara looked at her folder, which was still in her hand, perfectly unrumpled. Can we not discuss this until after the convening is over? Yes, Everest said. Absolutely. We will definitely discuss it after. The convening proceeded. Zara performed her role with precision, presenting the human liaison summary when called upon, answering the 3 questions directed at her from council members with clarity and composure, and trying not to think about the way the hall had gone silent at her voice, the way every ancient being in the room had stopped at a single syllable, the way Valdres had walked through the parted crowd without hurrying, and stopped close enough that she could have counted the silver threads in the dark fabric of his coat if she had been less determined to maintain eye contact. Afterward, when the formal proceedings dissolved into the complicated social architecture of post-convening networking, she was standing near the tapestry wall, reviewing her notes, when a court attendant appeared at her side and said quietly that His Majesty requested her presence. Zara looked up. When? Now, Miss Reeves. She followed the attendant through a door she had not been through before, into a corridor that was older than the main court sections, the walls a darker stone with carvings in the old script that she recognized, but could not read quickly enough as they walked. They went through a second door, and then a third, and into a room that was not a throne room and not a council chamber, but something between the two, smaller and far more dense with the weight of age, lined with shelves of books and documents and objects she could not identify, and lit by the kind of deep amber light that felt like the last hour before sunset. Valdres was standing at the window. There was no window, technically. It was a screen that showed the surface, and on it was the London street above, caught in the blue-grey light of a December evening. People moving along the pavement with their collars up. The orange glow of streetlights reflected on wet stone. He was looking at the surface world as though it were a very old painting. The attendant closed the door behind her. Your Majesty, she said. He turned. He studied her for a moment in the amber light, and she held still under it the way she had learned to hold still in this court, not rigid but grounded, not subservient but present. Sit down, he said, not unkindly. She sat in one of the chairs near the shelves. He did not sit. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and looked at her from across the room with that still, measuring expression she was starting to recognize as his default mode of paying attention. You know my name, he said. It's in the historical documents, she said. The ones I was given when I started the liaison role. Valdres of the Dreven bloodline, sovereign of the European court, established in the 14th century, re-established under the current blood laws in the 17th. She paused. I study what I'm given. You study it in detail, he said. It seemed important. Something in his expression shifted by a degree. Most humans who know the historical documents also know that the name is not used. You mean in address, she said. Yes. I knew that. I was. She stopped. She had been about to say that she had forgotten, but that wasn't entirely accurate. She had been angry, and the name had been the most direct thing available to her in that moment, and she had used it. I was making a point, she said instead, which was more honest. To Casimir. I was indicating that my presence here has a source of authority he cannot simply dismiss. By invoking my name as though we are equals, he said. The sentence was not inflected as an accusation, but it landed like one. No, she said, by invoking your name as though you are real, as though you are a person and not just a title, which you are. She met his gaze. I wasn't being disrespectful. I was being honest. Another degree of shift, something fine and almost imperceptible. Casimir will not trouble you again, he said. I know, she said. Thank you. That is not why I called you here. She waited. He moved, not toward her, but to one of the shelves, where he touched the spine of a book without taking it down, the gesture meditative. You said you were a little frightened, he said. After, when you asked. Yes. He turned his head slightly, not quite looking at her. Why only a little? Zara considered the question seriously. Because frightened is the appropriate response to a situation with some risk, she said. But I hadn't done anything wrong. Being in the wrong is frightening in a different way, a worse way. I had been technically reckless, but I wasn't wrong about any of it. And knowing you're right makes the fear more manageable. He turned to look at her fully then, and the look was the most direct he had ever aimed at her, not the lighthouse sweep of the council meetings, but something that stayed, something that was actually curious. You are an unusual human, he said. I've been told that, she said. Usually not as a compliment. It was meant as one, he said. The room was quiet. On the screen that pretended to be a window, London moved in its evening, unknowing. She looked at the books on his shelves. They were old, many of them, the spines worn and the titles in various languages. Some of the scripts were ones she did not recognize at all. How long have you been down here, she said, and realized too late that it might be an impertinent question. But he answered, in this court? Since the 17th century. In London? Since the 12th. That's almost 1,000 years, she said. It is, he said it with a kind of simplicity. Neither pride nor grief, just acknowledgement. Do you ever go up? She gestured at the screen. To the surface, he said, on occasion. He paused, less often than I once did. Why? He looked at her steadily. Because the surface world changes faster than it used to. And the more you change, the more you remind me of what I am not. It was the most personal thing he had said to her. She was aware of it, aware of the weight of it, the particular quality of something said without calculation. I think, she said carefully, that being reminded of what you are isn't the same as being reminded of what you lack. He was quiet for a moment. Perhaps, he said, and then, you should return to your quarters. The convening will generate administrative work tomorrow morning, and your counsel will be required. She stood. She smoothed the front of her jacket and collected her folder. She was at the door when he spoke again. Zara, he said. She turned. You may call me Valdris, he said. Here, in private. If you choose. She looked at him across the amber-lit room, at the ancient sovereign of one of the most powerful courts on the continent, standing by his shelves as in a room full of the accumulated weight of centuries, watching her with those silver-grey eyes. Thank you, she said. Valdris. The name sat between them in the room for a moment, real and present and unhurried. Then she opened the door and walked through it, and the corridor was cool and old and lit with a blue-white light, and she walked back through the 3 doors to the familiar part of the court, with her folder under her arm and her heart doing something complicated and entirely her own. Over the following 2 weeks, things changed in ways that were subtle and then less subtle. Casimir Vrath maintained a formal and frigid distance, which was the best possible outcome. The other council members adjusted their behavior toward her by imperceptible degrees, the kind of adjustment that indicated something had shifted without anyone needing to be told explicitly. Sorvain, the ancient vampire with the dark humor and the collection of extremely modern watches that seemed to delight her, stopped pretending not to notice Zara in hallways. Ilara, precise and brilliant and old enough to have watched the Renaissance happen, began including Zara's written briefings in her own council preparation in a way that felt almost like academic collegiality. And Valdris began speaking to her differently. It was not dramatic, it was not romantic declarations or significant glances across the council table. It was specific and small and cumulative. He asked her opinion in council meetings, directly, by name. When a new diplomatic problem arose, involving the relationship between the court and the French Human Government Liaison Program, he included her in the smaller working meeting that addressed it, and when she offered a solution drawn from comparative protocol analysis she had done on her own time, he adopted it without apparent hesitation and credited her contribution in the formal record. He sent books to her quarters. The first one appeared on her desk one morning without explanation, an old volume on vampire bloodline history in English translation. She read it in 2 days and returned it with a note that contained 2 corrections to the translation, footnoted and cited. The next morning, a second book appeared, and a note in handwriting that was very old and very precise that said simply, accurate. She found herself reading faster. In the evenings, when the court's administrative work was done, she sometimes wandered the parts of the court open to her. The library was the largest, a vast, subterranean space that made the word library feel insufficient, more like a civilization of books, organized by bloodline and era and subject in ways that had their own internal logic. She spent hours there, and twice she found Valdris there as well, at the far end of the room with something old open in front of him, and both times they had spoken, briefly at first, then longer. He told her about the court in the 17th century, when he had rewritten the blood laws. He described it with the careful distance of someone narrating history, but she could hear underneath the careful distance a different tone, something that was almost weariness, almost grief. The old laws permitted things that I had tolerated for too long, he said, during the second library evening, without looking up from the document he was reading. Harm to humans who had not consented to any relation with the court. Blood debts that could be inherited by children. Exile used as a weapon rather than a consequence. He paused. I ended them. Was there resistance? She asked. She was sitting across the table from him, her own book open and half read. There was war, he said simply. A short one. 3 bloodlines left the European court permanently. Casimir's bloodline nearly did. He turned a page. He has never forgiven me for it. He believes the old laws were dignity. And you believe, Zara said, watching him. I believe, he said, and now he did look up, and his eyes in the library light were very clear. That dignity is not preserved by cruelty, that a court which requires suffering to sustain its hierarchy is not a court worth sustaining. She held his gaze. That's not a popular view in rooms full of people who benefited from the old system. No, he agreed. It is not. You did it anyway. Yes, she looked at him for a moment. I think, she said, that you are considerably more interesting than the historical documents suggested. He looked at her steadily, and something in his expression warmed by the smallest imaginable degree, and he said, They rarely capture what matters. After that, the library evenings became a habit. Neither of them named it. It simply began to be the case that she was there, and he was there, and the books were there, and the conversations that unfolded between them were the most interesting she had had in years, ranging across centuries and subjects, and the particular intersection of human and vampire politics that was her professional domain and his permanent reality. He was protective in ways she was still learning to identify. When a visiting dignitary from the Eastern Court looked at her during a diplomatic dinner with the evaluative hunger that was the opposite of a compliment, Valdris had redirected the man's attention with a sentence so precise and so quiet that only she and the dignitary had understood what had just happened. When the court systems that regulated the underground climate malfunctioned during a cold week and the human quarters dropped to an uncomfortable temperature, new heating systems appeared before she woke the next morning. She had not mentioned the cold to anyone. She was not sure how he had known, and she thought perhaps she should not ask. She thought about it a great deal, the way he knew things, the way he anticipated, the way his attention worked. It was not the passive surveillance of someone monitoring a subject. It was the active awareness of someone who was paying attention because they wanted to. She was paying attention too. She noticed the way he moved through the court as though the space had been arranged around him, rather than the reverse. She noticed the way he listened when people spoke, fully and without performance, the quality of his attention, a kind of respect. She noticed the way he sometimes paused before speaking, not for effect, but for accuracy, as though he owed every word he said the time to be correct. She noticed in the library the way he sometimes looked at her when he thought she was reading, and the way he looked away before she could confirm it. She was reading, mostly, but her peripheral vision was very good. The crisis, when it came, came from inside. 3 weeks after the convening, a communication arrived from the Eastern Court, encrypted and formal, containing evidence that someone within Valdres's own court had been sharing internal diplomatic information with a bloodline that had been exiled in the 17th century, the same bloodlines that had left rather than accept the new blood laws. The exiled bloodlines had, in the intervening centuries, established their own structure, a counter-court of sorts, not powerful enough to challenge openly, but old enough and bitter enough to cause damage if given the right tools. The information that had been leaked was specifically about the Human Liaison Program, the schedule, the location of the liaison quarters, the security protocols, Zara's security protocols. Valdres called an emergency council meeting. She was there. He had included her without discussion, which itself was a statement, and Casimir's face had been a study in controlled fury when she had walked in. The council was grim. Sorvain had pulled surveillance records. Ilara had cross-referenced the communication logs. The leak was narrow, originating from within the administrative staff of the court, someone with access to the diplomatic record system. The liaison should be relocated, Casimir said, and he could not quite keep the satisfaction from his voice, the implication being that the relocation should be permanent and upward, to the surface, out of the court. Her presence has created a vulnerability. Her presence, Valdres said, in a tone that ended the sentence before it could become an argument, is not the vulnerability. The vulnerability is a traitor in my court. The information that was leaked relates specifically to her, Lord Casimir. Valdres's voice did not rise. It did not need to. The information was leaked about a protected liaison, which means the exiled bloodlines are looking for a tool, a pressure point. If they can access, harm, or leverage the humans' liaison, they create an incident that damages the liaison accord, which damages human-court diplomatic relations, which destabilizes the current political framework. He paused, very slightly. You understand this, of course. So your suggestion to remove the liaison is either short-sighted or intentional. The room was very quiet. Casimir said nothing. We will identify the source of the leak, Valdres said, addressing the full council. We will reinforce the liaison security protocols, and the liaison will remain in her sanctioned role. He looked at Zara then directly and said, I will handle your security personally until the matter is resolved, she said. That seems like a significant use of your time. Yes, he said. It is. She held his gaze for a moment, reading something in it that went beyond the political logic of protecting a diplomatic asset, and said, All right. The identification of the source took 4 days. It was one of the administrative clerks, a young vampire, only a century old, who had been recruited by the exiled bloodlines with promises she now wept over, genuinely distraught and genuinely dangerous. The mercy Valdres offered was a choice. Full cooperation and exile, or no cooperation, and the consequences of betrayal under blood law. She chose cooperation. She was gone within the day. In those 4 days, Valdres's handling of her security was, in practice, him being present. He walked with her to council meetings. He was in the library when she was in the library. But now, without pretense, sitting closer, the books between them as familiar as furniture. He arrived at her quarters each morning to walk with her to the administrative section, and each evening he walked her back. The court observed this. The court did not comment, at least not to her face, but she was aware of the observation in the way she was always aware of things in this place, peripherally and precisely. On the 3rd evening, walking back through the older corridor with the carved walls, she said, You don't have to walk me to the door. I know, he said. You've been doing it for 3 days. Yes. She stopped walking. He stopped too, and they faced each other in the corridor with the old script carved into the walls around them and the blue-white lights above. Valdres, she said. He looked at her with that still, full attention. Is this still about the security situation, she asked, or is it something else? A moment passed. Several moments. Both, he said. She studied his face, the sculpted pale beauty of it, the silver-grey eyes, the mouth that was usually composed and expressionless, and was currently neither. Can you be more specific about the something else, she said. He looked at her for another long moment, and she could see him considering, waiting, applying the same care to these words that he applied to every word he said. "In 400 years of this court," he said, "no one has called me by my name in a room full of witnesses and looked completely unashamed of it." He paused. "You were not being careless, you were being honest, you said as much." Another pause, smaller. "I find that I have thought about it frequently." "About the name?" she asked. "About you," he said. "About the fact that you read every document you are given and return corrections with citations. About the fact that you are frightened the appropriate amount and not more. About the way you argue with Casimir as though you have been doing it for centuries and he is simply being tiresome." His voice was very even, very precise. "About the evenings in the library." Zara's heart was doing the complicated thing again, the thing she had been mostly ignoring for several weeks. "I've been thinking about the evenings in the library too," she said. "You are human," he said, and there was something in it that was not a barrier, exactly, but an acknowledgement of a complexity, of the thing underneath the thing. "Your life is." "Short," she said. "Yes. I know." She held his gaze steadily. "But I am here now, and I am thinking about the library evenings now. The future is a real consideration, and we should discuss it honestly, but I don't think the future should be allowed to make the present feel like it doesn't count." He looked at her with those extraordinary eyes, and something in his face moved, something old and careful and long-held, shifting. "No," he said softly. "It should not." She reached out and took his hand. It was cooler than her own, firm and certain, and his fingers closed around hers with a care that was almost reverent. "Let's keep walking," she said, "and talk about the things that matter." They walked, and they talked. And when they reached the door to her quarters, they stood in the corridor for another hour, because neither of them wanted to stop. And the conversation moved through everything, his centuries and her years, the court and the city above it, the things he missed about the world he had known before the underground court became his permanent world. The things she loved about history. That meant she had always felt slightly displaced in her own time. He told her about seeing London before it was London, when it was something smaller and louder in a different way, fires and voices, and the smell of the river before the embankment existed. She told him about her mother, who had died when Zara was 16, who had read history books the way other people watched films, voraciously and for comfort. "She sounds," he said, "like someone who would have done very well in this library." "She would have loved it," Zara said. "She would have loved all of it." She looked at him. "She would have liked you." "You cannot know that," he said. "I can," she said. "She liked people who meant what they said. You mean everything you say." He was quiet for a moment. "You mean what you say as well," he said. "Even when it causes complicated problems." "Especially then," she agreed. He raised her hand, which was still in his, and pressed his lips to the back of it, the gesture formal and ancient and entirely sincere. "Good night, Zara," he said. "Good night, Valdris," she said. She went inside. She sat on the edge of her bed in the quiet of her quarters and held the feeling of his hand in hers, like something she needed to keep careful track of. The resolution of the court crisis came with a secondary complication. The exiled bloodlines, once their contact inside the court had been identified and removed, escalated. They sent a formal challenge to the European court sovereignty, which was a legal mechanism under the old blood laws, predating even Valdris's reforms, that allowed an exiled bloodline to petition for reintegration through a formal trial of grievances. It was old and almost never used, but it was real, and it required a response. The challenge was not about Zara specifically, but it cited the Human Liaison Program as evidence of what it called the court's capitulation to human political pressure, and it named the Liaison Accord as a corruption of vampire sovereignty. It was a challenge to Valdris's governing philosophy, the work of his centuries, the blood laws, and the peace he had made from them. The trial of grievances was held in the convening hall, and this time the hall was full to a capacity she had not seen before. Every bloodline with any historical connection to the exiled families was present. Every member of the human diplomatic community who held a formal relationship with the court was there, which meant people she had never met, older liaisons and diplomatic observers from 3 governments, all of them watching with the careful eyes of people who understood that what happened in this room would affect their working lives for decades. Casimir Vrath, pointedly, had declined to participate in the challenge. She had learned this from Everis, who had delivered the information with some satisfaction. Whatever Casimir's feelings about the human liaison program, his bloodline's future was tied to this court, and he was old enough to understand that the exiled families were not his allies, whatever they had in common ideologically. The trial was long and precise, and conducted in both the old tongue and modern language, with the court historians serving as translators and recorders. The exiled bloodlines presented their grievances through a representative, a vampire of impressive age and controlled fury named Drevian Salt, who argued with the eloquence of someone who had spent centuries constructing his case. He was good. Zara acknowledged this to herself with the fairness she gave everything she assessed. He was making a real argument about sovereignty and tradition, and he made it well. Valdris argued in response himself. She had not seen him argue before. She had seen him command and instruct, and occasionally dispose of opposition with a sentence. Argument was different. He was methodical and devastating and calm. The calm of deep water, not the calm of nothing happening, but the calm of enormous force moving in a controlled direction. He cited the blood laws with their own history against them, demonstrated that the human liaison program had originated not from diplomatic pressure, but from a provision in the original founding documents of the court, predating the exiled bloodline's establishment, and that the liaison accord had been ratified by every bloodline represented in this court, including the ones now claiming it violated their sovereignty, because those bloodlines had been part of this court when the ratification occurred. He was, Zara thought, extraordinary. The trial of grievances concluded at 3 a.m, by the clock on the wall, though underground there was no mourning in any observable sense. The ruling came from the court historians, who served as arbiters in such proceedings, and it was a full dismissal of the challenge. The exiled bloodline's petition was rejected. Their representative left without speaking further. The hall, after the ruling, did the thing halls do after long tension releases, a kind of collective decompression, voices starting back up, the sound of movement. Zara was standing near the document table where she had spent the last several hours, and she was tired in the particular way of having been tensely attentive for many hours, her eyes dry and her hands slightly stiff. Valdris crossed the hall toward her. He moved through the crowd, and the crowd moved for him as always, and he stopped in front of her, and his expression was not triumphant. It was simply settled, the way a foundation looks when it has held. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am," she said. "You were." She stopped, reached for the right word. That was remarkable. "It was necessary," he said. "It was both," she said. She looked up at him. "They were arguing against what you built. Your laws, your court, the life you made out of what you inherited." "Yes," he said, "and you defended it." "It is worth defending," he said. His eyes were on her, that full present attention. All of it. She held his gaze and understood that all of it meant more than the court. She understood it in the way you understand things that are too large and too real for immediate response. So she simply said, "I know," and he nodded, and they stood in the thinning crowd for a moment together, and the moment was complete. The weeks that followed had the quality of something settling into its true shape. The external pressure had been resolved. The internal breach had been closed. The court returned to its rhythms, with the particular steadiness of something that has been tested and found sound, and what was between Zara and Valdris settled into its true shape as well, slowly and naturally, and without drama, which was perhaps the most remarkable thing about it, that something which had begun with such a charged public moment resolved into something private and consistent and real. He took her to the surface, not during daylight, which he could not safely do, but in the late evenings when London was deep in its nighttime operation. And they walked through the old parts of the city, the parts that were genuinely old, that had the bones of centuries still visible in their structure if you knew where to look. And he showed her what he remembered, and she showed him what she knew from the books, and the two versions of the city overlapped and diverged and complemented each other in ways that made both of them see it differently. She held his hand in the cold December streets. He did not flinch from it or manage it. He simply held her hand back, and they walked, and the city moved around them. One evening, on the embankment, with the Thames running dark and fast beside them, and the lights of the bridges reflecting in it, she said, "What happens to us? Logically. I mean the long version of the question." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the river. "You know what happens," he said. "I know what the biology says," she said. "I'm asking what you think about it." He looked at her. The bridge light caught his white hair and made it silver, and his face in the night air was everything that he was, ancient and present, and hers in a way she had not yet said out loud, but had been feeling for weeks. "I have watched people I valued leave," he said. "It is the specific grief of what I am. I have made peace with it over the centuries, or I believed I had." He paused. "You have made me uncertain about the extent of that peace." "That's not nothing," she said. "No," he said, "it is the opposite of nothing." She turned toward him, fully, there on the embankment with the river and the city, and said, "There is an option. It exists. I've read about it in the bloodline history you sent me, the 3rd volume. The voluntary turn, under the accord, requires consent from both the individual and the king, and it is irrevocable, and it changes everything about a person's life. And I am not suggesting it right now, because it is too soon and too large for right now." She looked at him steadily. "But I am telling you that I know it exists, and I am not afraid of it." He looked at her for a long, careful moment. "You have been reading ahead," he said. "I always read ahead," she said. "I know," he said, and there was something in it that was tender, in the way that deep, true things are tender, not soft but genuine. "I know you do." She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, cool and precise and real, and he leaned into it, fractionally, the way someone leans toward warmth when they have been cold for a very long time. "We have time," she said. "More than most people think they have. Let's use it well." "Yes," he said. He turned his face slightly, pressed his lips to her palm, and when he looked at her again, his eyes were everything she had been learning to read, present and certain and full. "Yes, let's." He kissed her there, on the embankment, with the Thames running beside them, and London moving in its ordinary and unknowing night above the court that lay beneath it. It was not the kind of kiss that was a beginning. It was the kind that is a recognition, a settling, the feeling of something true acknowledged rather than discovered, because the discovery had been happening for weeks, in libraries and corridors and amber-lit rooms, and long walks through the old city. She kissed him back with everything she had, which was considerable. The months that followed were, by the standards of vampire court politics, quiet. Casimir Vrath submitted a formal written concession regarding the liaison program, which he framed as a strategic recalibration rather than a capitulation, and which Valdres accepted with the precise degree of graciousness that made it impossible to be embarrassing for either of them, which she thought was one of his particular skills, the ability to give people face-saving exits in ways that nonetheless left no ambiguity about the actual outcome. The human diplomatic relationships strengthened. Zara's work expanded, which she had not entirely planned, but found that she wanted, that the scope of what she was doing in this court felt increasingly like the work she had been unconsciously preparing for her entire academic life without knowing what it was preparation for. Lily came back finally in March. She arrived with the specific energy of someone who has resolved something difficult and is ready to move forward. She and Zara sat in the library for 4 hours and talked, and Lily looked around at the court, at the relationship Zara had found there, with wide eyes and a kind of delighted disbelief. "You called him by his name," Lily said at some point in the 4 hours. "In the middle of the convening." "It came up naturally," Zara said. Lily stared at her. "It came up naturally," she repeated. "I was making a point." "Zara. What? Do you understand what you did?" "In retrospect, more than I did at the time," Zara admitted. "And it worked out," Lily said, looking at her with an expression that was equal parts admiration and incredulity, "because you are apparently immune to the normal consequences of things." "I'm not immune," Zara said. "I just read the fine print." Lily laughed, the genuine kind, and Zara thought that this was another thing she had been given here. The continuation and deepening of something she had been afraid was slipping away from her. Everest, at some point in the spring, asked Zara if she found it strange, being human in a vampire court. He asked it with the direct curiosity of someone genuinely interested rather than making a point, and she thought about it seriously before answering. It was stranger at the beginning, she said. Now it feels like where I am, where I belong. She considered. I think you belong somewhere when you stop imagining leaving. Everest thought about this, and you stopped imagining leaving. Somewhere around the second library evening, she said. Maybe the third. The formal acknowledgement of her relationship with Valdris within the court happened without ceremony. It was not announced. It simply became known, the way things that are real and consistent and present become known, through the evidence of daily life, the fact that she sat beside him at council dinners, that he deferred to her analysis in areas where she had expertise, that they were both in the library most evenings and had been for months. The court adjusted. Courts, she had learned, are adaptive entities. They take their cues from their center, and the center of this one's was a sovereign who had rewritten 4 centuries of blood law in the direction of something better, and who was quite clearly in love with the human woman who had said his name out loud in the middle of the convening, like it was the most natural thing in the world. The conversation about the future came back around, as she had known it would, when enough time had passed for it to be the right moment and not simply an impulsive one. It was a summer evening, late, with the London heat filtering down through the ventilation in a softer way than the winter cold had, and they were in his private study, the amber-lit room with the books and the screen that showed the surface. She brought it up directly, because she had thought about it for months with the same carefulness she brought to everything she took seriously, and she had reached a conclusion she was sure of. I want to stay, she said. Long-term. The full version of long-term. He looked at her across the desk between them. You are certain, he said. I've been certain for a while, she said. I waited to make sure it was certainty and not just feeling. It can be both, he said. It is both, she said. That's how I know it's right. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working through the weight of it, not because he was uncertain of his own answer, but because he was taking her certainty as seriously as it deserved. There are things you will lose, he said. The daylight. The natural aging that humans experience as normal. He paused. There are things about the human world that you love. There are, she agreed, and I'm choosing this over them, not because they're unimportant, but because this is more important. She met his eyes. You are more important. Zara, he said, and her name in his voice was its own kind of weight, old and certain. I have read every document about the voluntary turn, she said. I know what it is. I know what it costs. I am asking you, formally and specifically, with full information and full intention. He stood and came around the desk and stopped in front of her, and his eyes were very serious and very full. The process takes time, he said. 3 months of preparation. It is not a single event. I know, she said. I've read it. Of course you have, he said, and there was the warmth again, the fine, warm thing behind his usual composure, present and real. He took her hands in his, both of them, and held them with the care he gave everything he chose to hold. Yes, he said, if you are certain. I am, she said. Are you? I have been, he said, since a human woman called me by my name in front of my entire court and looked completely unashamed of it. She laughed, a genuine full laugh, and he watched her laugh with the expression of someone who has been given something they did not know they were waiting for. You are going to be citing that forever, she said. Longer than forever, he said. I intend to be very specific about it. She leaned forward and kissed him, and he kissed her back, and the amber light of the room held them, and outside the screen the London summer moved in its ordinary, oblivious way, and beneath it the court continued its ancient rhythms, shifted and shaped by the slow work of centuries into something better than it had been, still continuing, still becoming. The 3 months of preparation were careful and exact, and everything she had read they would be. She understood each stage. She experienced each one with the same openness she had brought to everything in this place, not without fear, but with fear in the right proportion, manageable, because she knew she was right, right in the deep and settled way of things you have thought through fully and chosen clearly. Valdris was present for every stage, which was not required but was the kind of thing he did. The protection and presence he offered the people he chose, consistently and without performance. When it was completed, and she stood in the court she had come to 6 months ago as a temporary liaison, with a folder under her arm and a pen in her hand, she was still herself, the same accumulated knowledge and stubbornness and tendency to read ahead, but expanded now, extended, the boundaries of what she could perceive and experience wider and more vivid. The world looked different and also exactly the same in all the ways that mattered. Everis found her in the library that first evening, sitting in the familiar chair with a very old book open in front of her, and looked at her with the expression of someone who wants to say something significant and is working out how. "You look the same," he finally said. "I feel mostly the same," she said. "More vivid in some directions." "And the hair," he said, looking at her white hair, which had come in during the final stage, the inherent white of vampire coloring, no longer brown. "The hair," she agreed. "It suits you," he said, and meant it, she could tell. Casimir Vrath passed through the library entrance as she sat there, on his way to the historical records. He saw her. He stopped. His expression went through several things. He said stiffly, "Miss Reeves." "Lord Casimir," she said, politely, clearly. Exactly as she had always said it. He continued to the records section without further comment. She returned to her book. Valdris came into the library, an hour later, as he always did, and sat across from her and opened his own book, and the library was exactly as it had always been, the civilization of books around them and the deep underground quiet and the amber light at the ends of the long tables. She looked up from her reading and found him looking at her. "What?" she said.
"Nothing,"
he said.
"I'm reading."
"You're not reading," she said. "You're looking at me." "I'm doing both," he said. "I'm very old. I can manage it." She looked at him across the table, this ancient sovereign of the European court, white-haired and precise, and entirely hers in a way she still sometimes felt as a specific warmth in the center of everything, and said, "You are insufferable." "You have told me that before," he said. "I will keep telling you," she said. "Good," he said, and returned to his book, and she returned to hers, and the library held them in its deep and ancient quiet. And outside the court the city moved, in its unknowing life. And in the library the two of them sat in the familiar and chosen and entirely real warmth of what they had built, what they were building, what they would keep building for longer than any of the history books stacked around them had yet had time to record. She was still herself. She was still Zara Reeves, formerly human liaison, currently court diplomat and resident of the European vampire court and partner to its king, who read every document she was given and returned corrections with citations, and had once said a name out loud in a room full of ancient powerful beings without a single second of apology for it. Some things, she thought, turning a page in the very old book, do not need to change. Only everything else did, and it had, and it was good.